Thank you. Thank you. All right, good afternoon. That walk-on music was a bit of a surprise, but that's okay. Not going to complain. Good afternoon. My name is Vishy Gopalakrishnan. I have less than 7 minutes to walk through a bunch of slides. Let's get to it. So this is the title, How My Team Meets with 500 Startups Every Year. And we turn that from a top-of-the-funnel meeting into 100 commercial deals every year. Right? Let's get to it. That's me. I'll skip that. Most of you probably know AT&T, $190 billion of revenue, Fortune 10 company, about 270,000 employees. The team that I lead is called Ecosystem and Innovation. So let me kind of deconstruct what that means, because it's probably about as corporate as you can get, ecosystem and innovation. So my team does 3 things. Number 1, it serves as the eyes and ears of the corporation into the startup and VC ecosystem. So that's where the 500 startups comes in. The second part of my team is actually a set of 6 innovation centers around the world, 4 in the US, 1 in Tel Aviv, Israel, and 1 in Mexico City. And these are locations where we actually work on actual technology that we take to our business units. And the third part of my team runs a platform. Imagine, if you will, it's like a Kickstarter for internal employee innovation. So those are the 3 things that my team does. In terms of the accomplishments that I want to talk to you about 500 startup meetings per year. So if you think about the kinds of businesses that today's AT&T is in, right? Just to give you a snapshot of what that means, we are the 5th largest retailer in the US. We have 2,500 corporate-owned retail stores all over the nation. We are the largest pay TV provider in the world. And for some of you who've been paying attention, last year we acquired Time Warner, which is Warner Brothers, HBO, CNN, TNT, TBS, et cetera. So kind of the breadth of technologies that we as a company are interested in spans a pretty broad waterfront. Everything from networking, cloud, security, all the usual stuff, for those of you technical-oriented, layer 1 through layer 4. But then there's also a bunch of stuff around what next-generation media experiences look like. AR, VR, XR, what autonomous vehicles might mean for our network, et cetera. So what we typically do is when my team meets with these startups, we're looking at 2 things. 1, is this a capability that we can use internally? Whether it's for COGS reduction, better customer engagement, do a better job of kind of designing, deploying, and kind of managing our kind of global network. And or, is this something that we can push through our distribution, right? So the 2,500 corporate-owned retail stores. Or the other side of our business, which a lot of you may not be aware of, is we have a pretty large B2B or enterprise business. We have about 2.5 million enterprise customers. So what we're looking at is on that side is this something that a startup provides that we can either through resale, license, OEM, kind of push through on the B2B side or on the B2C side. And sometimes we run into startups that can do both, internal consumption and through the distribution channel. And from a startup perspective, what they're interested in is all of that. But we are also the single largest CapEx spender in the United States. So we spend on an average of about $20 billion of CapEx every year. So for a lot of startups, it's, they can land us as a customer. B, it's a phenomenal proving ground for their technology itself, because they get to kind of deploy the stuff at scale that very few companies can actually touch. So what my team ends up doing is turn that around and actually do internal corporate match.com, turn around, introduce them to a BU. And the BU owner can do one of 2 things. 1, they can tell us, go away, go pound sand, not interested, don't have the time, which is fine. We respect that. Alternatively, they could turn around and say, this is phenomenal. This is exactly what I need. Can you help me de-risk this? Can you help me prototype this? Actually prove it out that the technology actually works. It's not just words on a slide. So that's where my 6 innovation centers come in. Because again, the breadth of capabilities that we have, we can actually do some pretty quick prototyping. And what that ends up leading to is 100 signed deals with the BUs itself, right? In terms of prototypes, field trials, et cetera. And every year, we've had a pretty good track record of up to 10 of these actual prototypes actually end up in production, right? So if you think about from a funnel perspective, this is a phenomenal thing for our supply chain team, right? In terms of actually sourcing alternative suppliers, new disruptive suppliers across the ecosystem. So in terms of secrets of success, I'd rather call this scar tissue that you can learn from. We tried in the past partnering with all kinds of early stage startups. What we learned was that anything earlier than Series A doesn't work. The startup is not ready, and we would just crush them. Because we can give any startup tremendous amount of whiplash and completely derail them. So as a principal, we only talk to, for the most part, Series A or beyond. Number two, standardized legal documents. This is one of those small step for man, giant leap for mankind kind of things. Most of our interactions with startups, one-page NDA. Most of the time we can get from first meeting to if there's interest, within a week we can actually start working with the startup. So we've emphasized working with our internal legal team, supply chain, procurement, to make sure that we actually get to the real work fast and spend little time on the paperwork, which if you work for a large company, you know how big of a win that is. A couple of other things that we've realized. So part of my background is I also had my own company. I had another person on my team who's also an entrepreneur. We realized that the most critical currency for an entrepreneur is time. So we emphasize saying no very quickly early on. And we just don't give a blanket no, because we don't want to be seen as being capricious. So the no is usually qualified by here are some reasons why, or when you get to this particular stage, we want to re-engage, right? And what we found is over the last 8 years that my team has been in existence, the feedback that we get from the broader ecosystem is that this is what sets us apart. This is actually a very delightfully kind of pleasant experience for them because we get to know very quickly. Second part, document startups meeting. Every startup that my team has met over the last 8 years is meticulously documented in an online system. It's not anything fancy. It's a very simple browser-based application that we use. And what we do a good job of is making all of that information available to each of the 270,000 employees within the company. Because the reality is we don't want to hoard that information. So everything that happens, so you can actually see the chronology of when was the time we met, who did we introduce it to, where are we doing a POC, et cetera. We handle NDA kind of stuff. There's a way to handle that around. Obviously, we had our missteps. Broadly around communications, right? We thought that if we did a good job of interfacing with the external world, make it more inviting for startups and VCs to engage with us, that was necessary. Not true, bless you. What we realized was that equally important, if not more important, is actually internal engagement, and hopefully we can get to that in the Q&A. The other piece is not letting external hype get in the way, right? And again, how do you make sure that you stay grounded in what the business units within the company want to do? Kind of just in terms of going forward, this is an ongoing thing. We've not written the book. This is a journey. Driving deeper engagement with the business units. For a company that's about $190 billion in revenue, keeping on top of what the business units actually want, because we're in such a diverse variety of businesses, is super, super critical. So we can actually source the right kind of innovation into the company. The second piece, for those of you who are on innovation teams, communicating the impact of what the team does is super, super important. So what we realized is that, one size doesn't fit all. You need different vehicles, different form factors, different frequency, depending on who you're communicating within the company as well. So that's all the time we have, and I'm going to actually take any questions Larry might have.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vishy. Let's begin with, since you mentioned it in your talk, with amplifying your processes for communicating internally. And I just want to add to that. It seems that you really are basically trying to serve the needs of the business units, mm-hmm. which means that your communication processes have to involve making sure that you understand what their needs are, and what are the kinds of activities, what are the kinds of processes that you've developed to make sure you do that? And you talked about that as also being an important part of development going further. So could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So, there's a part of my team that does the outreach, right? So into the external kind of ecosystem, but the in-reach part, which is kind of the mirror image of that into our internal business units. So what we do is, in a typical year, we end up meeting with about 40 key business leaders within the company on an ongoing basis. We haven't set up a particular cadence, et cetera, because scheduling is always a pain. We meet with about 40 business leaders every year, sometimes multiple times during the course of a year. And what we also do is we're big on just kind of documenting. Don't want to have too much kind of tacit knowledge lying around, and making sure that we also put them into some kind of structure that has thematic elements as well. Because you could talk to a bunch of internal stakeholders and get a laundry list of things that they want to do, but I think we sit in a unique position within the corporation. We get to see what the folks, say, for example, in our media entertainment team in New York are interested in. But then the folks that run the pay TV business in LA are also interested in something. But you know what? Given the nature of the corporation, they probably don't talk to each other. So what we also serve as is a good place to collate a lot of these things. And actually, I didn't mention this during my slides, we also do the kind of, we are a key input into the corporate strategy and planning cycle as well, right? Because there's only so much that a corporate strategy team can do, but I think we bring a unique perspective in terms of what all the disparate business units are trying to get to.
You mentioned the term one size fits all, and it made me think about what you said about early stage, working with early stage firms. You seem to imply that it was, based on your experience, it was kind of a return on investment issue, so to speak. But would you say it also has to do with the goals, the primary goals of the corporate venturing unit? So, for example, in your case, when you're serving the business units, it's working with seed startups is much more difficult. You probably want to have something that's more advanced. But for a corporate, what would you say? Would you agree that for a corporate venture fund or unit that's looking for transformative technologies, it's like the examples that we had examples before, Bose and so on, would you think that's where that might be appropriate to have, or would you just advise in general, stay away, if you're in corporate venturing, stay away from the seeds?
I mean, I think I would stay away from kind of, just kind of a cardinal rule, right? Because I think every organization is different, the industry you're in is different.
Right.
I think the two prior speakers talked about, I think, the experience perspective of marrying both the strategic and the financial return.
Right.
I think on the both side, it was more around the kind of the strategic.
Right.
So it all depends on what you're trying to get out of if you have a venture fund. By the way, my team doesn't run a venture arm. So it depends on you. I think for our needs, by and large, we've stayed away from kind of very early stage. Because, there's an impedance mismatch because, as a large corporation, we all fall into the kind of the trap of knowing exactly what we want to do. And then you pair that up with a small set of, founding, like an entrepreneur group, 3 or 4 people. They're still trying to figure out what they want to do. They have an idea. Product market fit is not yet kind of happened. And then here we come in, the behemoth, kind of with a very prescriptive way of, if you want to work with us, this is exactly what you need to do. And I don't think that's a great use of anybody's time.
Could you just briefly summarize what you do? What are the key things you do in order to get the buy-in from the business units when to go ahead with production? Because that's a critical pitch.
So I think so to get into production, so that dialogue has to start way upstream, right? Because my team doesn't do any projects per se till there is an internal business holder's sign-off. So we use internally a one-page kind of document called an inception document, where the business unit stakeholder, typically a vice president or above, signs off saying, kind of here are the parameters of what we're trying to get done. In some sense, here is the experiment I'm running, here are the assumptions I want to validate. And so the dialogue that we have is as much about the technical innovation as much as it is about making sure that, yes, if this is successful, you probably are looking at a field trial with like 100,000 customers, live customers. Here's the control group, here's the target group. And this is kind of the scope of work that we'll be signing off on once we finish the prototyping stage. And at every stage, as we go through those stage gates, we're having the conversation about the next stage as well. Not that we want to get dragged down, but set the expectation so it's never a surprise to any of the stakeholders, like, oh my gosh, like where did this come from?
So you're meeting with 500 startups a year and you get 10 to production. How does that process work? I mean, you mentioned, do you start off in terms of your search strategy, you determine it depending on what the business, you meet with the business units and they tell you what they want, and how does that process work to get you to those 10?
Yeah, so my team has the, from a infrastructure standpoint, we are set up completely separately from the corporation. So we have our own IT, our own infrastructure, et cetera. So which means that to do a lot of the technology work, we don't rely on anybody.
Okay.
Right. So that gives you kind of a tremendous lever in terms of speed, both in terms of execution and in terms of kind of checkoffs that you have to get internally as well. So there is no kind of front door process, submit the request, wait for something to be provisioned. We just manage all of our infrastructure. Now we realize that obviously as you go through that process, the reality is that if you want it deployed in production at a company like AT&T, I have to imagine for a lot of you, your enterprise IT department probably has like, architecture guidelines, public cloud consumption rules, your CSOs get involved, et cetera. So we realize that. We are aware of those things, but we emphasize in the work that we do to get from 500 to 10, we emphasize speed as opposed to just too much rigor. And that's something that we were lucky that we were set up by our CTO 8 years ago. And he was very explicit that that was a muscle he wanted the company to acquire. We've been around for 140 years.
Okay.
So there's a fair amount of process that's ossified in some sense. And so we are kind of completely orthogonal to how the rest of the company works. Have we changed everything within the company? Heck no, but I think that top-down kind of support to drive that change kind of always is in the ether.
Very good. So you mentioned that you have a good deal of autonomy, and also you have a lot of the resources you need to move along quickly. What about with respect to legal documents and legal issues that are involved? How do you handle those as you encounter them?
Yeah, so I think early on what we did was we worked with our, as a large company, we have a large team of lawyers, people in procurement, supply chain, et cetera. And just to give you a sense, if you work through a typical kind of supply chain process at our company, you could end up spending anywhere from 18 to 24 months just going through and getting to be a preferred vendor, like an authorized vendor. So from the time we meet with the startup and we think this is something that we want to get kind of deep into, understand the technology, et cetera, we work with our supply chain team and our legal team to actually construct a one-page NDA. So which can be turned around, and I have the authority to sign that NDA, right? And then whoever on the startup side can do that. So in pretty much 24 hours, if we think that's what we want to do, we can get that executed. We rarely run into situations where startups don't want to use that NDA. So that's one. I think the second thing we've also done is, and this was also a big kind of step forward for the company, is I think I remember somebody early on in the morning, from Deutsche Telekom talked about this. We had to slightly reorient ourselves when it came to IP, right? Because when you work with startups, either their IP, our IP, or a lot of times we're co-creating with our enterprise customers, we've actually become much more, I'm not going to say laissez-faire about IP, but we realized that if you can't have open innovation without the open part, right? So that's informed kind of even the IP language that goes into, let's just say we're going to do a field trial, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of language that we put in. We've actually created custom contracts that kind of have slightly liberalized kind of IP rules, right? We've rarely run into a situation in the last 8 years as the team has been around that has been a stumbling block, right? Great. Which is refreshing for our teams, refreshing for startups as well.
And just very quickly, in the time remaining, could you talk a little bit about, as we've done with the other speakers, challenges that you dealt with respect to proving yourself, so to speak, meaning performance evaluation and incentivization?
Yeah, we've tried all kinds of metrics. None of them really work because innovation is a notoriously kind of difficult and squishy thing to measure. I'll start with just how we set our yearly goals, right? So going back to how aligned we are with our business units, my goals I set with my boss. I'm part of the office of the CTO within the company. So we are very focused on what the company identifies as the 3 to 5 key kind of business and technology initiatives, right? So for example, this year and next year, a couple of the goals are going to be tied very much to 5G, because that's a huge, huge thing for us and for the broader industry as well. So there'll be a couple of innovation goals tied to 5G. There are a couple of areas that are, a big part of what we have to do in terms of, as my team is, exploring new areas. So that was something, so that's kind of intentionally vague. So one of the areas that we kind of identified that we need to get into was quantum. So that's a huge that's one goal that we set. So working, in a public-private partnership with academia, national labs, et cetera. Not to be flippant, but at the end of the day, what I tell my boss is that if you go to the heads of the business units and you ask them whether the Vishy's team moved the needle for you, if you have to coax an answer out of them, you know the answer, right? I'm not trying to be flippant, but I think that's in some sense, that's the kind of the crucial yardstick for me. Because if the business unit leader doesn't know or doesn't feel the impact of what you're doing, then either you're not working on the right things or you sucked at communicating, both of which are bad. Right?
Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much, Vishy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for listening.